In this video, we're going to talk about something that every Gothi should know how to do. I'm talking about a modern Norse wedding or hand fasting. Coming up. Welcome back to Learn As You Gothi. Today we're going to talk about the modern Norse wedding or hand fasting. And it's important to realize that we don't have a lot of sources that describes the actual wedding ritual. Everything that we have is really more about the laws regarding the wedding ceremony and betrothal, as well as divorce and division of goods. So a lot of what we do is going to be taken from other sources, maybe Anglo-Saxon, or old medieval sort of traditions that have evolved into the modern era. But you also have to understand that modern asatru is not a recreation of the old Nordic ways. Modern asatru is its own thing based on the historical references that we have. But we have to bring it into modern times by using the information that we have available to us and then filling in the blanks with what feels right and proper to us here in this time and space. So most of what we have about the Nordic weddings is really just from the Icelandic Gragas, and then there's a little bit of mention of them in some of the sagas and the Eddas. A lot of it mythological, and even when you look back, maybe you'll see Thor's wedding to the Thrym, the giant, when he went masquerading as Freya. Those were mythological, but they would reflect the culture of the time and the wedding traditions of the time. So we can take those stories out of the myth, and we can sort of apply those generally to imagine the way that a wedding would have gone at that time. And you'll also see with something like the Elder Edda how things change a little bit when they get to the Younger Edda, and that's because culturally those stories reflect what the culture at the time, and that changed over the years as we graduated from the Elder Edda into the Younger Edda or Snorri's Edda. So there will be inconsistencies when you go through any of those kind of stories, but we just want like the heart and soul of it. And that's what we're going to talk about now, because every wedding that you perform as a Gothi shouldn't be rigid, stuck to the lore or to the little bit of information we have from history. It should be very rigid to the needs, the wishes, and the hopes of the couple that are being married. Even if it's not specifically Nordic, it should really encompass the elements that they want to see in their ceremony. Remember, this is one of their life's milestones, and it should be custom tailored to their wishes and their needs, even if they don't necessarily reflect what you want. If you can't do that, then you should probably just refuse to perform the ceremony for them in the first place. So most of what we have regarding any kind of a Viking wedding, because that tends to be where we go, is back to that Viking period, is either based on the lore, the sagas and the Eddas, or on the legal codes like the Gragas from Iceland. Everything else is just someone's interpretation of those base little things. Now, we don't have any actual physical account of an entire wedding from start to finish. Most of what we have, like I said before, is about the betrothal process, the divorce process, and then the division of goods throughout it and what makes the wedding legal. So I'll cover a little bit of that, but really what I want to talk about is the way that we've kind of adapted a modern wedding ceremony. So if you think that this might have some value to you, don't forget to share this video with your friends or your others who may either not only be performing a wedding, but maybe those that are considering having a wedding, because this might give them some ideas about how they want their momentous occasion to look. Now, the first part of the Viking wedding was always the betrothal process, and that just resulted in usually someone representing the groom would go to the father of the bride, and sometimes the groom was present. I think in most cases he was, but he wouldn't really talk up himself. He would have his buddy or his father or his uncle or somebody talk him up and talk about his worth and his value and his valor and all the things that he can bring to this family. And then they would agree on a bride price. And the bride price wasn't as if you were purchasing this woman from this family, although it can be interpreted that way. But the bride price was more about, it was paying compensation to the family because they're losing a hand. They're losing a cook. They're losing a farm hand, someone who can manage the animals and manage the land and manage the property and watch after the kids and all the other things that a young woman would provide to a household. They want to be compensated for that, and that's usually what the bride price was about. And then the bride would come with a dowry, and that dowry belonged to her. So the moment that the the couple was wed, that was her property and it was not to be taken away from her. Now it could be willed to her children. If she was to divorce, she would take that property with her. It was a really equal dispersion of wealth, that the husband would bring what he brought to it, the bride would bring what she brought to it, and collectively they would share these things, but individually they would own their parts of it. That's not really the world we live in today, but it's just, if you want to know more about that, you can certainly do some searching and do some reading about the old custom of bride price. But that's not relevant in today's society. We don't have a bride price unless you're maybe ordering a mail order bride from overseas. But but that's a whole different situation. But what we do is we generally there's a courting process that probably wasn't part of the original example, 1,000+ years ago. But for whatever reason, people decide to get married. We're going to push aside that whole betrothal process and just assume that a man has proposed to a woman, or vice versa, or any other combination that we're used to seeing. And we're going to go right into the next phase, which is the preparation for the ceremony itself. Now, in most cases, once the betrothal was accepted by the family of the bride, that process could only last about 12 months. If it was to go longer than 12 months, it had to be some extenuating circumstances. But also, the bride's family could extend it to 12 months. They didn't have to get engaged and then get married immediately. The husband could maybe go out on a raid, or had to serve the king in some way, or the family might be like, we can't give her up yet, it's planting season, we need her till harvest. You have 12 months or whatever to get your together and before the wedding. But if it ran longer than 12 months, it would usually have to be some circumstance, like maybe the groom was ill or wounded in battle and they had to apply for some sort of an extension. But generally it was done within a 12-month period. And that the length of that time was decided on at the betrothal process. So when you would get engaged, you should be planning to get married inside of a year if you wanted to be somewhat true to the history. The next step would be the preparation and the invites. So that's another thing in those times when people couldn't just travel around the world as freely as we do. Invites would have to go out, people would have to know of the engagement, and they would have to have time to prepare and travel. And there were other customs along the countryside about how you would have to host traveling parties going to and from a wedding, but we're not going to get too deep into that. All that information is there if you want to really dive into the sources. Generally speaking, the location for the wedding was at the bride's homestead, so that might have some sort of a connection back to where the father of the bride nowadays pays for the wedding. It might have some sort of a connection there, because generally that betrothal process or the ceremony happened at the bride's home. Not always, there were exceptions, but that was the general rule of the day. It's also accepted that in most cases the bride and the groom would wear their best clothes, and there is some reference to the bride's clothing being white or of white linen. So that could also be the source of the white dress that we see now so prominent in weddings. So in the Viking Age, when in the chapter on the bridal ceremony, it does say that the bride had a special dress for the bridal ceremony. It seems to be certain, though, in no saga have we a full description of the bridal dress, but from several passages we see that the bride was hvitt-folded or white-folded, suggesting that she was dressed in white, and linen-bunden or linen-bound, enveloped in linen. So those are all that we really have to tell anything about the actual clothing customs of the day. And so it's generally assumed that the bride would have this white dress if it was, if they had the means to do so, and the groom would come well dressed, probably wearing their best. They didn't have not everybody had a closet full of clothing, so they probably only had one or two articles in the first place, and they tuned up and cleaned up and wore the best that they had. Now the idea of a hand fasting, like you see at all the Ren fairs and everything, is more of a sort of a medieval thing, and possibly has some roots in the Anglo-Saxon traditions, but it is not, for any of my research, it's never found in any of the Viking weddings. But for some reason, it's a very popular way to do things nowadays, so I'll talk about that a little bit when we get into the ceremony, because it's actually a really neat ceremony to have. So the last part probably of the preparation for the wedding is going to be the feast. So there's always a wedding feast following the vows or the actual wedding ceremony. And that feast obviously needs to be prepared for. So if you are wanting to have a traditional style wedding, that should also be accompanied by a feast, like we do in most weddings nowadays anyway. As a special little side note, it is important to realize that even during the Viking Age in Iceland, it is in the Gragas, you are not allowed to marry within your family up to the 5th degree. So a 5th cousin or something, you were not allowed to marry unless it was a very special circumstance. So any sort of inbreeding, or because you hear about that, between royal families and stuff, that I think that was purely an English thing, or more royalty around Europe, but it was certainly not something that you would see among commoners. They generally wanted to broaden their family tree, not narrow it down to a trunk. So the ceremony itself, this is where we get a lot of leeway, and this is where you really have to sit with the couple that you're going to be performing this for and talk about what they want. And a lot of times that's not going to be something that you're maybe familiar with, or but it's nice to have some options that you can provide for them and lay out the ceremony according to what they want. And you'll see that the wedding that we'll present here at the end isn't traditional by any stretch, but it was what they wanted, and I did my best to give them exactly what they wanted, and the bride and groom were extremely happy with the way that it all unfolded. Although you can't look at it and say that it's any kind of a traditional Viking wedding, because we don't really know what that looks like. So really it's your do the best intention for the couple and have a lot of fun and make it a memorable occasion. That's your responsibility as the Gothi, or the leader of these rituals. So the ceremony has some different parts that we in the modern era, and I don't know where a lot of them came from, because I know they're not all traditional. Certainly the blessing of the bride's lap with the hammer is attested to in some of the lore, like with Thor's marriage to the Thrym, the giant, because when they blessed his lap, then he took up the hammer and he killed the giants and that. But you would think that if that's in the story, then it's something that's familiar to the people who wrote the story. So it would have been at some time in history, like when the Elder Edda was written, at some point that was the custom of the day, was to bless the bride's lap. It's also in most of the resources that I've read, the wedding party would be seated on the benches, and it is attested to that the bride would sit between the bridesmaids and the groomsmen. She would sit between them on the bench, and she would have a veil over her face. There's whispers of that in the lore or in the sagas. So that's all we really know. It wasn't a stand up before the officiant, like we would expect to see in a modern wedding or hand fasting, which we do anyway. It just feels more official and it feels right. But that wasn't the traditional way to do it. They would be sitting on a bench. The bride's lap was blessed with the hammer to provide fertility. Only later did it become have religious adaptations to it. So we know the bride's lap is generally blessed with the hammer. At least we have some sources on that with the sagas. But that's all we really know about any of it. There's also some mention of her having the bride being presented with keys to hang around her waist that shows her authority over the home. So we've taken that a step further in a lot of cases, and the bride will be given a set of keys by the groom to signify he's turning over his home to her, and then she will generally present him with a sword, signifying that she's turning over her defense and everything beyond the home to him. That's a modern interpretation. There's nothing that I'm aware of where that was a traditional thing, but it feels right to do it. And even Skogla and I, when we got married, we had that same situation where I gave her the keys and she gave me the sword, which we still have today. Now, if you wanted to make a modern wedding fun, if the couple was up for it, you could actually bring the father of the bride and the groomsmen up before the officiant and have them negotiate for the bride. It would be sort of a fun exchange. He's a service member, or he's a police officer. He serves his community well. He's of high honor and high stature. He owns his own home. That kind of stuff to just kind of beef up the groom, and then the father of the bride can negotiate. It would be a fun, but it would be scripted and it would be very cartoon-like. But I think it would be a fun event if people were if they wanted to make light of the situation. But I think in most cases people would want to take their wedding a little bit more serious, or their hand fasting, and wouldn't want to be playing those kind of games. But some people just have a light heart and make light of these kind of things, and I think that that would be a fun way to do it, is to have that negotiation for the bride in front of all the gathered people. You wouldn't want the couple to elope. They would generally, it needed to be witnessed by a party of, I believe, 12, and had to be officiated properly with the proper negotiations, or the children were not inheritance born, which means that they wouldn't be able to inherit from the mother or the father, because they were essentially illegal children because the wedding wasn't sanctioned properly in the law. None of that's really relevant today, but if you wanted to stick to the little bit that we actually know about that time period, then it would have to be a public wedding. It'd have to be sanctioned by both parties, authorities such as their parents or whatever, and it would have to be done before at least 12 witnesses. Now, the ceremony itself, there's no mention of who the officiant is in most cases. Maybe it's the king or the earl, or possibly the father of the bride. They don't make any sort of a big deal about it, because I think it's probably just not a big deal who did it, or if anybody did it. It may just be everybody was a witness and they swore an oath to each other. But we don't even have any accounts of them swearing an oath, and it's likely that they didn't even exchange rings. We don't have any accounts of rings being actually exchanged. That seems like a modern interpretation of potentially swearing the oath on an oath ring. But nevertheless, people want to have a ring. I wear a wedding ring that we swore our oaths on, and it's just sort of the modern way that we do things is a ring exchange. So you can really kind of design that ring exchange however you want to, whatever, make it look like whatever the couple wants to do. They can say their vows to each other, they can swear an oath together, they can drink from a horn. Later interpretations of that ceremony added potentially a blessing from the gods, a bloat following the swearing of oaths, swearing of oaths to Ivar, who was a goddess who is said to hear the oaths of married couples. All of those are later interpretations, and in some cases oaths are sworn or blessings are sought by Freya as well, and that seems to be a pretty common thread. Var and Freya, and generally Thor, with the blessing of the union with the hammer. After the blessing of the union, after the ceremony is concluded, however it's designed by the couple and the officiant, which modern day would be a ordained Godar. After that ceremony is conducted, we go into the feast. And the feast is an important part, and generally you would do, in the later Viking age, when they would have added that particular part to the wedding, then they would do the bloat there. They would do the bloat, or the slaughtering of the animal, and then going into the feast. And then the feast can last as long as the party could afford. There's accounts of kings' weddings feasts lasting in excess of a month. Other people's wedding feasts lasting generally about a week, which is because it takes a long time to get someplace. You got to put these if you invite people to your wedding, you got to put them up for the week or whatever. At least that was the way back in the day, when people had to come from long distances in order to witness it. Nowadays, you could have a catered feast or whatever. You could have a traditional bloat if you wanted to go along with that ceremony. When I do a wedding, I generally do the bloat as part of the wedding ceremony itself, because it feels right to ask the gods to come witness along with the gathered people. But that's something that you can work out with the couple. They may not want to bloat at all. And then we have the hand fasting, which a lot of people find to be an attractive, sort of a medieval Anglo-Saxon sort of an addition to it. And I think that it's a really cool addition too, where the couple will hold hands and you will lightly wrap them with a ribbon of some sort, and then generally bless the ribbon with the hammer, blessing the lap of the bride. Because in the modern times they would be often standing, not sitting, for the ceremony. But these are all things that you can discuss with them and work out specifically with the couple to make sure that they get the wedding or the hand fasting that they want. Because ultimately, that's your goal, is to provide them a service and give them the ceremony that they want. Now, I've heard tell that the word honeymoon comes from the father of the bride offering or gifting the new couple a month's worth of mead to get them through while they brew their first batch for the household. I don't know if there's any truth to that. Sounds great. Sounds like that's a really cool origin of the word honeymoon, but we don't really know that to be a fact. But if you want to believe that, then believe it. If you know of a reference to that, absolutely put it in the comments and let me know. In fact, any of this stuff that I talk about, if you know of any references where I say it's vague, if you know of any written sources, put them down in the comments. I'll be more than happy to run them down and annotate my own thoughts on this process, as well as share that with the rest of our community. Now, post-ceremony at the feast, this is the point where they would often give gifts. So they would give gifts of practical things, I guess sort of like you would now, given a microwave or dishes or fine china or something, as well as things that increase the wealth of the new couple, such as lands and gold and fine jewelry and clothing. So all of those things were appropriate wedding gifts, and depending on the rank and status of the couple, probably if you wanted to gain some sort of favor from this new couple, especially if they are royalty, you would probably give gifts that were a little outside your price range in order to gain some sort of favor by the new couple, especially if they happen to be leaders in your district. But if it's just a farm couple, you give them a pitchfork or something practical they could use, or some dishes, or some, a coat of mail, or a sword. Something like that would be absolutely, fantastic gifts for the wedding, for the couple. But also, the couple, or at least the father of the bride, would generally give gifts to the guests as well, because they came so far. And you'll find that that's a thread that's woven through almost all ceremonies in the Old Norse and the Viking days, was people gave gifts to their host, and the host gave gifts to their guests, almost all the time in all occasions that I'm aware of. And the last and most important part, maybe most important part of the wedding ceremony, is the consummation. And I'll let you figure that one out on your own. Check down into the description, because as soon as it's available, I'm going to post a link to a wedding handout that you can make a small donation and download, and that will help you get through a future wedding. And one more point that I want to make real quick is that I think in most ceremonies it's important that you speak from the heart, and you just, it just comes out of you. But in the case of a wedding, because you're performing this task specifically for someone else, and it's not necessarily anything that you're used to or seen before or have any kind of a rehearsal on, I think that it's okay to write all this stuff down and read it or work off of a piece of paper. You should probably practice it and rehearse it so that it runs a little bit smooth. But I think that it's perfectly acceptable to not have your heart be in it, but to have your service be in it. And part of that service would be giving them exactly what they want. And the only way to do that is to have it listed out and rehearsed and ready to go and read off of a piece of paper. So I wouldn't normally say to do that in any kind of a bloat or a naming or anything like that. But in the case of a wedding or hand fasting, I think that that's absolutely necessary if you're going to serve the couple the way that you should be serving them as their godar. And the last major point is that you should charge for your services. If you're going through all this trouble to craft this ritual and perform it for a couple, the only way that we can keep down on this religious tourism, people who want a Viking wedding because it's free, is to charge them roughly the same amount as they would be charged by any of the local churches or pastors. And just take a poll, just call your local church and be like, hey, can I talk to the pastor or to the admin? Like, what would it cost to have a wedding there performed by the pastor? Oh, okay, it'll cost this much or that. They're pretty free about it because they want that Skrilla. So they're going to tell you what it's going to cost roughly. Or maybe some of them will say it's by donation. So what's the suggested donation would be your next line. And, the suggested donation is $500. So if that's generally what it is in your area, then that's what you should be charging. In my case, I generally charge the equivalent in silver. It feels right. It feels traditional. Give me, $200 worth of silver, and I will perform this thing, or $50 worth of silver. Whatever the thing is, it just feels like a fair trade. But you should be compensated for your services, and it cuts down on religious tourism or people just trying to get a free ride and a cool Viking wedding because they are cheap. So if you enjoyed that video, then hang around for a minute, because following will be a video about wedding that I did for a couple most recently at a Native American cave in Washington, a historical site that was very important for the culture of the natives of that space, and we did a Nordic hand fasting in there, but we also honored the spirits of that cave before we did it. So that's going to be coming up. Follow that link and enjoy the video. Torvigi, my friends. Now, just as an added bonus, if you follow this link right here, you'll get to see my latest wedding that I performed for a couple in a cave. I don't know if I can drew a blank.
You look like you drew a blank. It was like...
Deer in headlights.